Okay, we're starting a new Mishnah, continuing with the comparison of various different laws that we've mentioned so far. We started with the connection of Purim was laws of the laws of Adar Rishon, Adar Sheni, the first month and the second month. Okay, so now we're continuing, the Mishnah is continuing with comparing a variety of other halachas. Hold on. Okay, so we're holding the Mishnah. The Mishnah says like this. Little background, there's a concept called, we learned about it in verses we learned in the past few months. We're talking about the laws of the high priest, hey Aaron, hi Z. So we have like this. We have the what's called a Kohen Mashuach and a Kohen Marbe Begodim. What are we talking about? We're talking about the high priest. So in the time Moshe Rabbeinu, in the times of the desert, like we learned, Moshe Rabbeinu, one of the things that he made was the Shemen HaMishcha, the special oil that was called the anointing oil. It was never made again. It's not allowed to be made by commoners, but it was never made after Moshe Rabbeinu, and it was kept until the days of Yeshayahu, the king, final righteous king of the house of David. His descendants, sons and grandsons, were the final four kings of the house of David, and that led to the last 24 years after he was killed by the Pharaoh Paro Neche, and started already the cycle of Babylonia and Nebuchadnezzar, and it led to the destruction of the first temple. But in his life, he buried some things. One of the things he buried was, of course, the ark. The ark was buried before the destruction. It was never captured. So all those ideas that the ark was captured is not true. It was buried in the times of Yeshayahu in a special that was built by King Solomon. When King Solomon built the temple, he built the field, or the hey Bruce and Julie. The King Solomon built the temple with locations that were open and hidden. And in his hidden location, he built a place for the ark to be hidden before the destruction. In that, they also hid the staff of Aaron, which we learn about in Parshas Korach, and he also hid the Shemen Hamishcha. Means from the times of Yeshayahu forward, there was no more anointing oil. So how did someone become a high priest? One of the things you have to do is anoint the high priest. So when they put on the begadim, when they put on the clothing of the high priest, then they became the high priest. Means then they kicked in their position. So now we want to know, is there a difference between a high priest, hey Shuki, that was anointed by the Shemen HaMishcha, by the special oil that was made by Moshe, and the ones that were from the end of the first temple, the last 24 years, and through the second temple? They didn't have it again in the second temple. There was no more anointing oil. Again, incidentally, that was the same oil that was used to anoint the house of David. So he says, Ein bein koyin mashuach, and it's going to come back with the Mashiach. Ein bein koyin mashuach b'shemen hamishcha l'merube begodim elepar haba kol mitzvah. So the mission says there's no difference between a high priest that was anointed with the special anointing oil that was from Moshe's times, again, buried in the time of the king Yeshayahu, or any the high priest going forward that became high priest because there was no anointing oil by putting on the clothing. So it's called a meruba begadim. Once you put on once you put on the garments of the high priest, so now you become the high priest, but you don't have the oil to anoint.
Recording in progress.
So what's the difference? So he says the difference is par haba kol mitzvah. Now, what is par haba kol mitzvah? A bull that comes on the mitzvahs, meaning to say, we'll see in Rashi, but basically, there's sacrifices that we have to make when there is a misunderstanding in the law or a misinterpretation of the law, either by the Bezdin, by the Sanhedrin, by the leaders, or the high priest. If the high priest makes a mistake, he has a special sacrifice that he has to sacrifice, which is called the par haba kol mitzvah, the bull that comes on a mitzvah that is connected to a prohibition that would be you would die from the death of kares, of being disconnected. He does it by mistake. He has to bring a special sacrifice. That special sacrifice is only brought if you are a high priest anointed with oil. If you weren't anointed with oil, means any high priest going into the second temple or the last 24 years of the first temple, they didn't bring that special sacrifice. Okay, so Rashi says, Masnisa meruba begadim. What does it mean, a high priest that put on the clothing and was not anointed? Koinim sheshimshu b'bayis sheni. Any high priest that was the high priest in the second temple, ve'af b'bayis rishon, also in the first temple, mi'emois Yeshayahu, from the king Yeshayahu. Again, the king Yeshayahu was the last righteous king. The next four kings after him of Yechaniah and Yehoiakim and Tzidkiyahu. These were all bad kings, one way or another, and he's the last righteous king. He realizes this is the end. Yirmiyahu is very prophesizing about the destruction of the temple. He hides the ark, and he hides the oil, the anointing oil. The Eilach Shenignaz, it was hidden. Tzalochis shal shemen hamishcha. The special flask of anointing oil was hid together with the staff of Aaron, together with other things, especially the ark was hidden in the times of Shio. They no longer had the anointing oil. So what happens if you become high priest and you don't have the anointing oil? You don't have to bring the special sacrifice. You don't have the special sacrifice of the bull of Kol Mitzvah. What is that? Kohen Mashiach, especially a high priest that was anointed. Shahayra heter b'davar shizdaini kares. If he made a mistake and he said that it was permissible, something that had he done it willingly, means bemazed, transgressed it willingly, he'd be punished with kares. Kares means it's a kind of death, a severe kind of death, meaning your soul is disconnected. And he went according to his ruling, in misinterpreting the law. He didn't know, he made a mistake. So he has to bring a sacrifice, because we know we bring atonement even for a shogeg, especially for a shogeg. If you do something by mistake, you have to bring a chatas. He has a special chatas, par, a special bull, shnemar, because the verse says in Vayikra 4:3, that if the Kohen Mashiach, meaning the high priest that was anointed, who did a sin, has to bring a special sacrifice. I'm just going to bring up for a second the chapter 4 in Vayikra, because over there's two times we have two types of sacrifices that have to be brought for a mistake. So we have what we just brought now. So it says over here in chapter 4, verse 3. So it says, if the anointed Kohen sins, brings a guilt to the people, because if the Kohen Gadol's job is to be righteous, so if he does a mistake, it affects the people, then he shall bring for his sin, which he has committed, an unblemished young bull as a sin offering for the Lord. This special sacrifice is only brought if you are a high priest who was anointed by the oil. If you were a high priest that did the same mistake at the end of the first temple, the second temple, when they did not have the anointing oil, and the way you became high priest was with just putting on the garments, you did not bring the sacrifice. You brought another sacrifice, but not this unique special sacrifice. Later we have in the same chapter about what happens if the people make a mistake. Chapter 4, verse 13. And if the entire community of Israel makes a mistake, v'nelam davar me'enei kahol, and it's called a chatas nelam, means they made a mistake, that the Sanhedrin, the court made a misjudgment. So then there's a special sacrifice, helam davar. It's called a special sacrifice for helam davar. That's not the sacrifice we're talking about. That sacrifice is brought, even though it says, Behevia kohen HaMashiach, that the anointed Kohen brings this on behalf of the people. And we learned that the extra HaMashiach is coming to teach us that does not include that this also includes the high priest that was not anointed. So the special sacrifice for the congregation, if the courts made a mistake, that they always did. But the one for the high priest, if he made a mistake, that was only done if he was anointed by the oils. That's the only difference. Okay, that so says the Mishnah. So he says, let's learn the Tosfos. The Tosfos also says, so he says, Pirish, para koyin Mashiach shachata b'shaygig. Again, if the bull that has to be brought by the anointed high priest who makes a mistake, does a sin by mistake, the asa echad mikol mitzvahs and shemashay ta'asena, he does a mitzvah that he should not be doing. It means he transgresses something he should not transgress. V'ashem medavish is doini kares, and he made a mistake in something that had he done it on purpose, knowingly, he would be punished with kares, again, a severe death. Tosfos says, we're not talking about verse 13, where the high priest does it on behalf of the community if the courts made a mistake. The tzibur, that's the communal sacrifice. The chsiv bei hakoyin hamashiach also says, the Kohen who was anointed, skip the parentheses, the marvina mitaras kohenim, ba'afilu kohen hedet yochel havi v'kosh kohen meruv begadim. Why? Because this could be brought by any priest, even a kohen hedyet, even a regular priest could bring it. So surely the high priest who's wearing the 8 garments, again, what's the difference between a regular priest and a high priest? A high priest wears 8 garments, a regular priest wore 4 garments. The high priest brings this sacrifice even if he was not anointed. That's what Tosfos is coming to teach us, that the second part in chapter 4, verse 13, that talks about another special sacrifice when there's a mistake, that is brought by the high priest who's not anointed, which happened in the times of the Second Temple. Let's see what Rabbi Steinsaltz has to tell us. He says, when anointing oil was available until the time of King Yoshea, who sequestered it together with the Ark of the Covenant and the tablets, the high priests were consecrated by anointing with this oil. It means they used that oil to make a high priest the high priest. However, afterwards, the high priest was appointed by pronouncement, says the Jerusalem Talmud, and assumed his position by donning the 8 garments. So once after they didn't have the anointing oil, what made you the high priest when he put on the garments of the high priest and performed the service of the high priest? Okay, so after the destruction of the first temple, the end of the first temple, they no longer had the anointing oil. What does it mean a par ba'a kol mitzvahs? Rabbi Steinsaltz teaches us this is a special halacha with regard to a high priest, as written, if the anointed priest shall sin so as to bring a guilt on the people. Again, the guilt is not that the people did the sin, but if he sins, it brings a guilt onto the people. So says Rashi in Vayikra 4:3. If he mistakenly issued a lenient ruling with regard to a prohibition punishable by kares, which again is a severe death, means when I mean severe, it's not so much painful, but your soul is disconnected, that's severe. And he acted in accordance with this ruling, his ruling, he is liable to bring a bull as a sin offering. This sin offering of the bull is only if he was anointed. We don't know why. There's a verse that supports that. But the reason why is obviously deeper. Based on the phrase, if the anointed priest, it is clear that any other priest is exempt from bringing that offering. Again, I have to check the Rambam. I don't believe he doesn't bring any offering. He brings another offering, but not that special offering of the bull. Meruva begadim, a common priest wore 4 garments, while the high priest wore 8. So what does it mean that he wore the garments, the multiple garments? Is because the high priest wore 8 versus the 4 of the regular common coin. Okay, the Mishnah continues. Now, there's another law. This is a disagreement in what we're talking about here with the Rambam and the Rashi, but basically like this. What happens if a Kohen Gadol is a high priest is no longer available to serve as a high priest? Now, there's 2 scenarios. One is that something happens temporarily to the high priest. If, for instance, on Yom Kippur, it never happened, but let's see on Yom Kippur. That's one of the miracles that says that if the Yom Kippur has to be pure, if he has a seminal discharge on Yom Kippur, he can't perform the avodah of Yom Kippur. Someone else has to step in. That someone else who steps in becomes a high priest in place of the high priest. Whatever, he gets a blemish. Something that happens to the high priest, he can no longer perform the duties. So he gets put to the side because he can't perform the duties. They promote another Kohen in his place to be the high priest. Now, according to Rashi, what happens when that passes? He's no longer blemished, or he purifies from seminal discharge. So now what happens to the Kohen Gadol who stepped in for him? He can't just go back down to being a regular Kohen, because once you get elevated to the high priest, you can't get demoted. So it gets kind of complicated. So ein ben Kohen mishamish the Kohen sha'avar elapar yom kippur v'asir seifa. So the Mishnah says that a high priest who's mishamish, means the one who was high priest, comes back to his job after he had to go away for whatever time it was that whatever put him on side. So the Kohen that sha'avar, that was high priest in his place and now was put to the side, what is the difference between him? There's 2 high priests now, right? You can't have 2 high priests if it gets complicated. It causes ava, causes disagreement. So he doesn't sacrifice a Yom Kippur, and he doesn't bring the daily sacrifice that the high priest has to bring daily. It's called a Asir Seifa. Those 2 things he doesn't do, but everything else he has to do, meaning he has to wear the 8 garments. There's a machlokes, there's a question. Some people say he doesn't. We're going to see that some people say he can't do anything. He's not a high priest, and he's not a no priest. He's not a low priest. So he kind of gets just left to do nothing. Now, but he and also has all the restrictions of a high priest. He has to marry a virgin. He's not allowed to become impure. He's not allowed to cut his hair. All the restrictions, the strictness of a high priest he has, but he doesn't act as a high priest. Now, it's very possible he could be promoted again if he's, let's say, the son, etc., of the high priest or whatever, if the high priest passes away. Rambam seems to understand that we're talking about where the high priest that kind of goes into retirement. What happens if the high priest goes into retirement? Right? The high priest can't, he's a human. He can't perform the performances anymore. He's got old. So then he's considered the one that gets pushed to the side, and the one that's mishamish, the one that is in his place. So there's two high priests: the one that was high priest and had to retire, and then the present high priest. But the others say that we can't be talking about that because obviously he can't sacrifice. He's not functioning anymore as high priest. So that's why there's a little complication. But the Rambam seems to understand we're talking about a retired high priest. But the common understanding is we're talking about a high priest that had to just be put to the side for something temporary, and he came back to his job. What about the person who filled his spot for that little time? So Rashi says, Kohen Mishamish, he gives an example. She'ir by psul. Something happened to the high priest that made him disqualified temporarily. Uminu acher tachtav. We appointed someone in his place. V'avar psule. Now whatever disqualified him is gone. Let's say he had something temporary. V'chazal avidase. Now he's back to his job. V'haviru haba tachtav. And the person who was in his place has to be demoted because he's no longer high priest. Is Kari Mishamish V'Sheni Aver. The one who's the Harishan, the one who's serving now and who was serving before initially, that's called the one who's serving. The one who's passed over, who moved to the side, that's the one who stood in temporarily. By the way, the halacha brings down, the Gemara, I think, the Tosfos says in Yuma, from this we learn that this applies to any job of communal responsibility. If a rabbi or a gabbai or a president of a shul, right, has to take off for a month. Let's say he's in a medical crisis, what have you, and then gets better. So halachically, you can't say to the old president of the shul or the old gabbai of the shul or the old rabbi of the shul, well, we hired someone new, it's too bad, you lost your job. Once they become better, once they become qualified again, you have to put them back in their old job. So the Tosfos and Yuma says this applies to any communal job, not just the high priest. But what is the difference? Par Yom Kippurim, she'ef shel havi shnayim. You can't bring two sacrifices for the Yom Kippur, which is the special bull that's brought for the high priest. Only one brings it. That's the one who's acting. Means the one who was initially, according to Rashi, goes back to his job. The special sacrifice, that daily sacrifice that the high priest brings upon him on behalf of himself, that has to be brought only by the high priest who's acting, not the one that was temporary now put back down. She'ef shel havi shnayim, you can't bring two. Okay, we're going to learn this Tosfos as well. Amen. Kohen mishamish l'sha'av kohen shavar el pariyam kum kasha. So the Tosfos asks the question: Amai nakid lekohen shavar da'afilu b'yom she'ira by psul lekohen hamishamish v'shimish zeh tachtav have chiluk zeh shapar ba min hamishamish af b'shem mishamish. He says, what happens in the case where, let's say, it's Yom Kippur, and the high priest is going to do the job, and then he has a seminal discharge, so he can't act as the high priest. But he had everything ready. He had all his sacrifices ready. So the one who steps in on his behalf sacrifices whatever he had ready. So he says, why don't we use that as a case? That even a kohen, even a high priest, that is acting as high priest, not that he was put back down after the person came back. Even now that he's acting, he uses the sacrifices of the one that was before him. He sacrifices what the other person had prepared, even though he can't act in it because he became impure. Like the Gemara in Yishalmi says, that instead of saying that the difference is between a kohen that is now in service and versus the kohen that was once in service who stood in temporarily, even the one that stood in temporarily presently doesn't sacrifice his own sacrifice. He only sacrifices what his predecessor was prepared, and then he will take back his job after whatever long it takes for him to become pure again. So Tosfos answers, "Dinaket la'isei she'avar have a mashma, ha la'isei she'avar kvar the have bechol shana." He says, he says, because if you're talking about the one, the inaket la'isei she'avar, if you're talking about the one that passed over, So we would think that have a mashma hala oisei she'avar kfar, one that was means if we're talking about only one that is the temporary Kohen Gadol, that he doesn't sacrifice his own sacrifice, he sacrifices what the one before him prepared, meaning to say that one which was that was a Kohen Gadol a while ago, not presently acting. There's many differences. That when we're talking about that, even this person who was passed over and is no longer Kohen Gadol because he was upgraded and then he was demoted when the guy got his job back, the only difference between him and the high priest is the Yom Kippur service and the daily sacrifices. Now we ask the question: Lamai depreciation shapar havim yoisish ir by psul afgak shein mishamishim ken kasha maha damer say perk shvus asher loy v'loy mishal achiv hakoinim v'adrab hoylei loymer v'loy mi oisem shamish. Based on what we said that we learn about the Yom Kippur sacrifice, that the Yom Kippur sacrifice has to come from the high priest's money himself. We should have thought even deeper that even the person who's acting as high priest, he doesn't use his own cow; he uses only the one that prepared it. Okay, so he says there are v'shama mishum dehavim nosel shchicha. He says it never happened, or very rarely happened. Therefore, we find something that can happen every year. Meaning to say like this: that we want to bring a scenario that's something that's common. It's common for the high priest to have to pay for his own sacrifices, and not for the other priest to give him money. That every year could happen. Every year we have to tell the high priest, you have to pay for it. Whereas the case where someone steps in when you become impure, that's a rare scenario. We don't talk about that. Okay, that's just, I shouldn't have studied this Tosfos because it's not really important to the subject at hand. Okay, let's go further in the Gemara. Okay, but for a high priest, back to the initial Mishnah, if a high priest that's anointed and a high priest that puts on the clothing that doesn't have the oil, they both bring the sacrifices of Yom Kippur, and they both bring the daily sacrifices of the high priest that has special for the high priest. So the Gemara says, "Masnisim d'loik Rameir." Our Mishnah does not go according to Rameir. Why not according to Rameir? What's Rameir say? The Rameir says, "Meruba begadim mevi para ba kol mitzvahs." Rameir disagrees with the initial statement of the Mishnah. He holds that a high priest, even if you just put on the clothing, you weren't anointed by the oil, you still bring the special sacrifice, the bull, for the sin if you made a mistake in a severe sin of kares. Divramer, he doesn't understand the verse to exclude or to only include one who was anointed by the oil. The Chachamim disagree with Rameir. This means the Chachamim would be our Mishnah, which say that a high priest that was not anointed would not bring the special sacrifice. My time with Rameir. The Tanya Mashiach ain't li Mashuach b'shem Mishkan. So he says, how do we know? So he says, because, let's just see the verse again. I think it doesn't say HaMashiach, but that's later it says HaMashiach. 3. HaMashiach, it does say it. So Rameir says, what's the reason? Because you would think it's talking about the anointed one. But the fact that it says HaMashiach, an extra hey, doesn't have to say the high priest HaMashiach that was anointed with the extra hay. The extra hay is coming to teach us that it includes, even if he wasn't anointed actually, but he just became high priest by appointment by putting on the garments. So the Gemara says, what do you mean it doesn't go according that our mission doesn't go according to Rameir? Let's see the end of the mission. The mission says, the second part of the mission says that again, a high priest that had to be put to the side, and we promoted another high priest, and then we demoted him because we no longer needed him because the first high priest came back to his job. That the only difference is between the sacrifices of Yom Kippur and the daily sacrifice on behalf of the Kohen Gadol. Halachol divrayim zev shavim, meaning to say that there's two high priests. For everything else, the second high priest that stepped in temporarily to fill the gap, he has all the restrictions of a high priest. Like we're going to learn, what does it mean? He has to marry a virgin. He has all the things. That goes according to Mary. How do we know? The Tanya, we learn this brisa. Ir by psul. If let's say on Yom Kippur there was or something happened to the high priest that he became disqualified. We had to appoint another Kohen Gadol. So after the psul, after the disqualification is only temporary, goes away. That's what the Rambam says, that he becomes old, then he never comes back to his job unless he gets a vigor of energy again. But let's say whatever, he comes back to his job, So now the first one goes back to his job. Sheni, what about the second one? He was high priest for a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever it is. Kol mitzvahs kuna gedolah. He has to keep all the restrictions of the high priest. That's the opinion of Rameir. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rishon chayz lavedase, Sheni eni roi loy lekoyin gadol v'loy lekoyin hadid. Rabbi Yossi says no. He's stuck in between. He's not a high priest because he can't have two high priests, and he's not a regular kohen because he was elevated, and therefore he's kind of stuck in between. He doesn't do anything. So he's kind of, it was I don't know if you want to say benefit, not a benefit. Doesn't mean that he doesn't get the benefits of a kohen, like tithings and stuff, but he can't service. The Gemara says, "Halachol divrei mishaben, v'im ba lahaktir oy la'avid shum avodim mishamish b'shmayim begadim kohen she'aver ki kohen hamishamish." What does it mean that he's equal? That if this kohen that was high priest for temporary wants to do service, he could do service in according to Rameir, but he has to wear all the 8 garments, which means to say, just incidentally, I'm assuming this. Incidentally, they must have had a few sets of gear, because, and we're talking about a few sets. We're not just talking about pants. Obviously, there's more than one pair of pants, but we're talking about the ephod, the special apron. We're talking about the choshen, a mishpat. We're talking about the breastplate that had all the stones on it. These are difficult things that he had. It was hard to have one, never mind two. Yes, Barbara, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I'm reading this book called The Jews versus Rome. And today in the chapter that I read, it said that the Romans, when they were ruling, that they would take the high priest's garment and that they would have to be checked out for the high holy days from the Romans. Was that true?
It could be. I mean, yeah, things weren't simple. It's very possible. It depends where the source of it. If it's coming from Josephus, it depends. We're going to learn. I'm not sure if we're going to get there, but the next piece of Gemara, maybe next week, we're going to learn about the house of Chania, which is a very complicated story. Which, doing some research on it, there's a clear difference between what the Rambam writes, what happened, and what, say, Josephus writes, what it was. So it depends what the source of it is, but it definitely makes sense. Things were not easy under the Romans.
It's not just Josephus. It's another gentleman by the name, first name's Barry. I can't remember his last name right off, but it's not Josephus. I questioned everything Josephus says.
Yeah, so it's not again. Yes, we have to. I mean, we have to know what's the source for it. But yeah, it's very likely. But here we're seeing clearly that either there was two sets of all the garments, of all 8 garments, because the second Kohen Gadol had to have his own set, or he borrowed from the first one. I one of the two. He couldn't borrow it because the high priest always had to wear his garments. So there had to be literally all 8 garments, and one of the 8 garments is not an easy one, which is the breastplate, which had the stones on it. That was an expensive piece. Not just expensive, it was also not easy to find the stones. Kol mitzvahs kahuna gedolah alav mishamish beches begadim. He has to wear all 8 garments. Loi peruav loi parim umitzvah absula. He can't cut his hair. He can't be unkept. He has to marry a virgin. Umuzra al alamana makriv einon. He can't marry a widow, which is the special law for the high priest. It doesn't apply to regular priest. He sacrifices even if he's in oinon, even if he's waiting for the burial of a father or mother. That's the opinion of Rameir, but Rabbi Yossi says no. Rabbi Yossi, so Rameir seems to be our Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi says no, he can't wear 8 garments and he doesn't wear 4 garments. He kind of is stuck in between. He can't get elevated, he can't get demoted. So he's kind of in between. But he doesn't wear he can't serve as a high priest. Just regular service is not related to Yom Kippur. The Ritva writes that even according to Rabbi Yossi, he doesn't disagree that he doesn't say that he doesn't have the other restrictions. He can't marry a virgin. All the other restrictions of how he keeps his personal being, that he has to keep, even according to Rabbi Yossi. But he doesn't serve because the reason is Ava. Ava means complications. It's a high priest doesn't, even if it's a loved one, even if you're a high priest and you're a special person, Ava means kind of you're not excited about that. There's another guy running around in the garments of the high priest. So, kind of to keep the original, the OG, in his comfort zone, we say, the second one should not be walking around in the 8 garments. Okay, I mean, but the Ritva says nevertheless he has to keep other restrictions. Tosfos has a question. When we're talking about this, one of the disqualifications of the high priest, let's say according to Rashi, was, let's say again, if Yom Kippur morning he wakes up and he had a discharge of a semen discharge and he can't do the service. One of the things we say in the Pirkei Avot, that never happened. It never happened. It was a miracle that never happened to the high priest. So the Tosfos says that it could be it never happened in the first temple, but in the second temple it could be it did happen. That's just a side note. Okay, the Reb Steinzat says like this: the sanctity and the status and all the prohibitions of the high priest continue to apply to the former high priest, again, the one that just came up temporarily. When he serves, he dons the 8 garments. That's according to the opinion of Rameir and our Mishnah. He may not become impure even when his relatives die. He does not grow his hair or rip his garments in mourning. When he is mourning, he sacrifices offerings during his period of acute mourning. That's that even if he's an onan, he still sacrifices. It is prohibited for him to marry a widow. He is required to marry a virgin. And one who killed another unwittingly returns home from the city of refuge upon his death. Okay, that's an extra addition that he adds, meaning to say, we know that the laws of city of refuge that we're going to learn about in this week's parshas is that if you kill someone, you have to stay in the city of refuge until the high priest dies. If the one who passes away is the temporary one, the one that stood up, if he also will let people out of the city of refuge, that's good to know. Okay, he says over there, Rabbi Yossi says no. He can't be anything. He's in between. This is explicit in the Jerusalem Talmud C or halacha with regard to the opinion of the Rambam. Even according to Rabbi Yossi, the replacement priest is not fundamentally unfit to be high priest. It is merely to prevent animosity, which is Eva, animosity, and competition that the 2 high priests cannot serve simultaneously. Although the sanctity and the status of the second priest is that of a high priest, he does not serve. He does not serve as a high priest, but he doesn't. He still has the sanctity. The Ramban Nachmanides writes that when the first priest dies, the priest who's temporarily replaced him takes a precedence in the choosing of his successor. So again, this is one thing. Like I said before, the Ramban says that if the first high priest passes away, the one who stood in temporarily is the first choice to be a high priest unless there's a reason that he's not qualified. Okay, what does it mean if the high priest is rendered temporarily unfit and another priest is appointed in his stead for the Yom Kippur service? The high priest resumes his position after Yom Kippur, and his replacement is relieved of his duty. Nevertheless, all the mitzvahs of the high priest remain incumbent upon the temporary replacement, although he does not perform the service of the high priest. If he does perform the service of the high priest, the service is valid. Okay, that's important to know. In accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. So basically, the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yossi, as halacha is in accordance with his opinion in the tractate of Yuma. So, by the way, of the argument, the opinion is of Rabbi Yossi that he doesn't serve. Because according to Rameir, he could serve. He just can't serve on Yom Kippur, and he can't serve the daily sacrifice for the high priest. Otherwise, he serves as a high priest. Basically, Rabbi Yossi's saying is that animosity, Eva, is kind of, you don't want 2 high priests. You don't want 2 people walking around with the garments. It's confusing. Rabbi Yossi says this, Maaseh Rabbi Yossi ben Elam. There was a person once called Yosef ben Elam in the city. He's from the city of Tzipori. She'era by Psul b'Kohen Gadol. A high priest became disqualified. Uminu tachtav, he became appointed after him. Others say that the one that was demoted or became disqualified was his father. And the rabbis had to give a ruling. After the disqualification, the first one goes back to his job. And the rabbis ruled according to Rabbi Yossi, that is, that the one that was the temporary is not a regular Kohen, not a high priest. He doesn't do any service. He can't be a service of 4 garments. He can't be a service of 8 garments. Therefore, he can't serve. You can't serve if you don't wear garments. And therefore, he has no service. Again, he has all the restrictions according to the Ritva. He has all the restrictions of the high priest. He definitely gets the benefits of the priest, means tithings and other things, but he can't serve in the temple. The incident was also related in Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus, mentions the story, when a disqualification repelled the high priest Matis. His relative, Yosef ben Elam, relative, others I saw he was a father, was appointed in his stead for 1 day. So he was a 1-day high priest, and then he can never serve again. Kohen Gadol mishum Eva, Kohen Gadol mishum. So why can't he be a high priest? What was the rabbi's concern? So to be another high priest, you can't have 2 because Eva, animosity. the first high priest is like, I don't want another high priest. And not a Kohen Gadol. Once he was very elevated to high priest, he can't just be a regular priest. Therefore, we see that the first Rameir holds that he could sacrifice even the special sacrifice, and then our Mishnah holds like Rab Meir that says that that he could serve. So our Mishnah doesn't go according to Rab Meir in the first half, but goes according to Rab Meir in the second half. So the Gemara says yes, the first half of our Mishnah goes according to the rabbis, which says that the high priest that only puts on the garments and doesn't get anointed can't do the special sacrifice for a sin offering. But the second part of our Mishnah goes according to Rameh, which says that a demoted or the high priest that was the replacement high priest can serve as the high priest aside for two special services of the Yom Kippur and the daily sacrifice. Before we do the Tosfos, Amar Reb Chizda, he says, "In Reish Rabbanim Sefer Rameir, Rabbi Yosef Amar Rebbe He V'Nasiv Aliba de Tanoi." So the question is either we say that the Mishnah itself goes half according to Rameir, the first half according to the rabbis, the second half according to Rameir, or Rabbi Yosef says it's Rebbe. Rebbe, who's the one who authors the Mishnah, he chose to take the opinion of Rameir in the second half of the Mishnah and to take the opinion of the rabbis in the first half of the Mishnah. So Tosfos asks an interesting question. We'll learn it. Tosfos says, "Kasha, lama lei high time the tefik lei, the Givon deroi le Kohen Gadol ilav mishum eva imkein how yochel l'shamish bar begadim any yochel l'shamish bar begadim mishum dav lemechus begadim." So the Tosfos asks, what do you mean? Why do we have to say that the reason why, according to Rabbi Yossi and according to the rabbis, once the person becomes a temporary high priest, he can't become a regular priest? Why do we have to say because you only get promoted, you can't get demoted? We should just say that if the only reason is animosity means really he should wear 8 garments. So if he's wearing 4 garments and he's lacking garments, and a high priest can't serve in 4 garments, and it's only the animosity, which is like a technical problem. So Tosfos says no. Mishum high time makpidin given the alpi bezdin who ilav time with the mailan. So the Tosfos answers no. That if the Bezdin says animosity, then Bezdin changes the law and says he could wear 4 garments. So why can't he wear 4 garments? Because it's a demotion and we don't demote someone, we only promote someone. Again, this is a rule in Torah in general, that we have Ma'il Mekodesh V'lei Meridin. Once someone gets elevated, we don't demote it. The same thing applies to space. A synagogue can't become, you can't demote an ark to something basic. You can't demote things of high sanctity. Can't be demoted to a lower level of sanctity. Once something gets elevated, it can't go back down. You can't turn a synagogue into a regular home, because once it became a synagogue, it's a synagogue. And then in New York City, there's buildings, in other places, but I see it in Brooklyn. You see buildings that were once synagogues that are unfortunately not synagogues anymore. The other buildings. The question is, how did they sell them? There's all kind of laws of how you could sell a synagogue. You can't just sell a synagogue. You have to make conditions and all these kind of things. Why? Because once something gets elevated, you can't bring it down. If a high priest becomes a high priest, he can't become a regular priest. Rabbi he v'svara ali b'denafshei v'nasiv ali b'tanoi merubim begodim savlak rabbanan v'koyin sha'aver savlak Rameir. So Rabbi is the one who decides, and he took half opinion he took of Rameir and half opinion he took of the rabbis. Okay, let's do the next Mishnah. Another case. This is a interesting Mishnah. Okay, let's just do a little history. That we have Moshe Rabbeinu was told after the sin of the golden calf came down from the mountain on Yom Kippur, and he said, "Chevra, we're building a tabernacle." Everyone knows, right? V'asli migdash v'shachanti b'sochem. He built a tabernacle. The tabernacle was in the desert all the days of Moshe. Then the tabernacle itself had evolved. Eventually, it ends up sitting 300 plus years in Shiloh. Everyone knows about Shiloh. That Shiloh was a special place for the tabernacle. After the tabernacle, there was times when the tabernacle itself was destroyed in Shiloh. After the war with the Philistines, then with the sons of Eli. So there was what's called Bamah Gadol and Bamah Ketana. Until Shlomo Melech built the temple, there was a thing called a private altar. A person could have had an altar in their backyard and do a sacrifice. That was called a Bamah Ketana, small altar. Then you had Bamah Gedolah. What was the Bamah Gedolah? The communal altar. Not always was that communal altar in the Mishkan, because sometimes the Mishkan wasn't standing. So but the question is, what gets sacrificed on the what's called the communal altar, or what gets sacrificed in the private altar? Once the temple was built, and this is again a machlekes we're going to learn in the next Mishnah, but the accepted halacha is, once Shlomo Melech built the temple, no longer were you able to have a private bamah, a private altar. And by the way, the Jews struggled with that. The Jews struggled with that the entire first temple. It was an amazing thing that even if they're able to, even the good kings, they were able to eradicate idol worship, they couldn't get rid of the bamahs. They couldn't get rid of the private altars. People were not giving them up. They didn't give up the private altars. It was very difficult. You see about the good kings. Oh, the good king, he did everything amazing. He couldn't get rid of the private altars. People wanted to have their own private space with God. And they wanted to have the opportunity to do their own sacrifices. And although they were doing it for God, and the Torah says you can't have it, it's kind of a contradiction. But we know that that's not always a contradiction in life. People do things that they feel spiritually connected to, even if the law says you shouldn't be doing it. They're not saying it's right, but that's what we see. We still struggle with that idea today, and it's called the Bamah. Right? If someone wants to do something for God and opens up the book of the Shulchan Aruch and says you're not supposed to be doing it, that's a Bamah Katana. That's a small altar. I mean, you want to do something, you want to have your own altar, your own space, even though the halacha says you shouldn't have it. But in the beginning, until Solomon built the temple, there's a machlekes. It's not so simple. There's machlekes. Once the temple was destroyed, if the bamahs were permitted again. That's going to come up in the next Mishnah. But the tradition is that it was not. It was that you can never have a small bamah. You can never have a private altar after the temple. All right, and this is why till today there's the question of if we could sacrifice today, and that's why it's not so simple. It means today the temple is not standing. But if someone goes on Temple Mount, and that's why these people every Passover, they catch the chevra that are trying to sneak on a goat into the Temple Mount, because in theory, if you get to the Temple Mount, then you could slaughter it. I mean, Temple Mount is if you could find a place in the Mizbeach, it's not so simple that you can't. That's a discussion. But let's see it inside the Mishnah. Ein bein bama gedola bama katana. What's the difference between a large altar and a small altar? Again, this large altar we're not talking about necessarily with the temple. El psachim. That only with regard to the Paschal lamb. That the Paschal lamb cannot be sacrificed on a small altar. It can only be done on the large altar. Zehaklan. Now the Mishnah says this is the rule. Kol shehu nidar v'nidav karev v'bama. Anything that was a vow or a donation could be sacrificed on a bama, on a private altar. The kol she'eni loy nidav v'loy nidav any karev v'bama. Whatever is not considered, it's not a vow or a private donation, doesn't go on the bama. Okay, we'll have to get back to this statement because we're not still clear yet from the Mishnah what can be done and what cannot be done. Let's see Rashi. Rashi says, "Ein bein bama, ein hefresh, b'shas heter bamas." When it was permitted to have a small altar. Again, that was definitely prohibited after the building of the temple. When Shlomo Melech came in, he said, "Leibasi ala menucha lanachla." Once God set up the temple in Jerusalem, means the whole 300 so years of the judges, there was private altars. We have clearly, right? Manoach, the father of Shimshon, does a sacrifice. So that's he didn't do it in Shiloh. So Shiloh didn't prohibit the small bamas. But whenever you're allowed to do the small bamas, bein bama gedola, I think so. To check again. Now I'm starting to question that. Ein hefresh b'shas heter bamas bein bama gedola zem mizbeach shel Moshe ba'oide b'noy v'givon. What is it considered a large altar? A large altar is when there was a large altar in Nov and Givon. These are two places that wasn't the official space of the Mishkan. Again, there was times that they only had an altar, or that whatever they had as a Mishkan was temporary. Shiloh was destroyed. Shiloh was, for some reason, I'm not sure, the Christian community, when they come to Israel, like our fantastic ambassador from the United States, Mike Huckabee, they're very into Shiloh. I'm not sure what the connection of Shiloh is, but Shiloh is something that till today we know where ancient Shiloh is. We're going to get there in a second. So the Bamah Gedolah was talking about they had Moshe's altar that was up in Nov and Givon. The Bamah Katana Mizbeach Shal Yachid. A Bamah Katana means a private altar. Shekol Yachid v'Yachid Oiseh Bamah Latzmi. Every person had their own altar in the backyard, and they would sacrifice. Again, the Jewish people, even after the Temple of Shlomo, they struggled with it. They couldn't get rid of the private altars. Some way or another, see, what was the problem? Some way or another, the Rebbe always speaks about this. When you go a little bit deviate from what you're supposed to be doing, even if you start off with righteous ideas, but if you're not listening to what you should be doing, that could trickle an effect that you end up sacrificing to idols. The Bamah Katana, even though they meant it for God, but it was something that you shouldn't be doing. And if you shouldn't be doing it, eventually it led back to idol worship. You could do a sacrifice on the small altar. Anything that's a donation, a vow, gets put on the small altar. But if it's not a vow or a donation, the tractate Zvachim shows us how we know this law, that cannot be done on a private altar. Okay, the Gemara is going to explain what does it mean. Psachim v'sulai. The Gemara says only a paschal lamb is the only difference between that a paschal lamb has to be done on the big altar and cannot be done on the small altar. Ema ke'eim psachim means to say anything like psachim. What does that mean? Rashi explains. V'haktani sefer kol she'ein nidav v'nidav ein karev v'bamaktana v'ilu b'gdola hayu makrivim karbanis tzibur tmidim u'masafim. But even on the big altar in Nov and Givon, they had all kind of sacrifices. They did the daily sacrifice. They did the communal sacrifices. The communal sacrifices and daily sacrifices surely cannot be done on a private sacrifice, but that was done on the big one. So why are you saying the only difference is the paschal lamb? All the daily sacrifices are done only on the large altar. So the thinking of the Gemara was initially that even the non-set communal sacrifices were done on the large altar. And that comes say, only things that are set times, like the paschal lamb, was done on the large altar. But there are certain sacrifices which weren't done on the large altar if there was no temple, which means the ones, the sin offerings or the avodah zarah offerings. If you worshipped idols, that's not a set sacrifice. That's only if the event happens. If you do the sin, then you have to do it. So anything that was a donation or a pledge, that was done in a private. Anything that was set time but was for the community, that was only done on the large altar. Like he says, the morning sacrifices, the musaf, the holiday sacrifices, the Rosh Chodesh sacrifice. Okay. Mani, who's our Mishnah? Mishnah says Reb Shimon, it's the opinion of Reb Shimon. The Tanya, Reb Shimon Omer, Reb Shimon says, Af tzibur lo yikrivu el psachim v'chayvis shekvu lamzman. The community only sacrificed the paschal sacrifice, v'chayvis, and the ones that were obligatory, that have a set time, like the morning sacrifice or the holiday sacrifice. Reb Shimon says, but if you have obligatory sacrifices, but it's not a set time, it's only if the event happens, like for instance, let's say the community serves avodah zarah. So that's not something, obviously, that there's no schedule for serving avodah zarah. So therefore, that didn't get sacrificed even on the large altar. Means there's basically, from this we learn, there's three statuses of sanctity. There's temple and tabernacle established. Then you did all the sacrifices. Then you had the private, only could do donations and vows. And then you had the altars, like in the time of Nov and Givon, that had a communal Moshe's altar, but didn't have the tabernacle. So then you only did the daily sacrifices, and you only did the obligatory sacrifices that have a set time, like the holidays and the new month. But a sacrifice that's obligatory and for the community, but it's not a set time. It's not something that we don't know. It's either if the event happens, that triggers the need for the sacrifice. That was not done in Bamah. Incidentally, we're going to learn later that when the Jewish people came back in the second temple, they also set up the Mizbeach before. This is when you talk about. I don't know if Aaron, you were talking about it, someone else was talking about the community of the Temple Mount Faithful, the ones that are trying to build up all the things for the temple. It's not so simple. These are difficult laws of, can we sacrifice today? The Jews came back from the time of this first temple, after the destruction of the first temple, and before they built the second temple, they put up the Mizbeach. And we're going to learn later they put up the mizbeach and they put up kind of fencing or shades, curtains to set like boundaries. But they put up the mizbeach before they put up the temple. Many years, I think 25 years. 25 years before they put up the temple, they had the altar up again in the second time of the second temple before Ezra came, and they sacrificed. So therefore, based on that, those are the opinion that today also you could sacrifice on Temple Mount if you know where the mizbeach is. And they knew where the mizbeach was. They had, I don't know all the details. I'm not familiar with all the laws to know what the basis for people to think that they could sacrifice today, because I'm not sure how we would know where the mizbeach is today. But maybe they do know. Maybe they're using the Yecheskel and the commentaries and the prophecies of Yecheskel maybe to figure exactly where the mizbeach would be today. Because you have to know exactly where the mizbeach is. You can't just go up on Temple Mount and slaughter a goat. Okay, so who is this opinion of? This is opinion of Reb Shimon. So Reb Shimon basically says that there's a third qualification. There's temple, there's private altars when that was permitted, and then there's a public altar, not in the times, not with the temple, and then you don't do communal sacrifices that don't have a set time. So Rashi says like this: Mani masnisin. Who's our Mishnah? The Ketani Bamah Ketani Enkar Ba Shum Chayva. Bamah the Bamah Gdaina Lo Yadifa Minei El B'Chayva Sekvus Zman. Who's the opinion that holds that on a small altar there's no obligatory sacrifices, only donations and vows? I mean that's private. I made a donation. I made a vow. I have to bring a sacrifice. And a large one. The large altar only is the chayvais, the obligatory ones that have a set time. But ones that don't have a set time, like Helm Dover or Seir Avodah Zarah, that you didn't even sacrifice in Noven Givon. There's a lot of discussion about Noven Givon. Noven Givon was a temporary place after, again, the Jewish people, the time of the judges is a difficult time, right? So the Jewish people come in. I believe we're going to learn that the first Shiloh is after 14 years. So the first 14 years, the Jewish people cross over Jericho with Joshua and they conquer the land. The first 14 years, I think the tabernacle was somewhere around, let's say, Jericho. Then they put it into Shiloh. From Shiloh, it stayed until the time of Eli. In Eli was the last of the judges. He's the one who's the teacher and the one who kind of gave over his rule to Samuel the prophet. Samuel the prophet already is with David, right? Even though he's anointing David. But in that period of time between the end of Eli and David, the temple and the tabernacle was all temporary. So there's a lot of questions. The questions if they brought the first fruit. There's a lot of questions about what was the status of Nov and Givon. Okay. So it says Reb Shimon, it's the opinion of Reb Shimon. He says in the last tractate of Zvachim, Af tzibur lo hikr v'bam gedola. El shum chayve el b'sachim v'chayve sakavu lehem zman. That according to Reb Shimon, you only did on a large altar that was without a temple or tabernacle, only the Paschal lamb and other obligatory daily sacrifices or holiday sacrifices that have a set time. Avachayvis, obligatory sacrifices, she'en kavu lam zman, that don't have a set time. Kigoin, what's an example? Par helam dover. If you have to bring a sacrifice for the community, if you made a mistake in the law, that's only if the event happens. Or Sira Vardazara, or if you have to do a sacrifice for idol worship, again, that's only if the event happens. If they did not sacrifice it even on a large the communal altar. According to the rabbis, they disagree with that opinion. They hold that whatever was done by Moshe was done in the oil moed of Gilgal. The Bamah gedola afilu par helm davar masnisin ketani pesach v'kiyatzmet. That they also did the communal sacrifices, and that was considered also a big altar. I have to check about Gilgal if they had it when he says oil moed. Okay, definitely in Shiloh they did all the sacrifices. I don't think Reb Shimon argues about Shiloh. He's talking about Givon Nova. I don't think they had a tabernacle up then. I have to check on that. Okay, let's just finish the Tosas, and then I'm going to show some pictures of Shiloh. Mani Masisin Rabbi Reb Shimon he Damer Afti B'Leikriv Nira the Givon the Makmin Masisin Reb Shimon Im Kain Sefer Nami Asik Avasei Dektani Zaklal Kol Hanidar Vanidav Karv Makasha. Okay, let me just see if this is something you want to learn. Okay, he goes into the question about other sacrifices, like the sacrifices of the Nazareth, or the sacrifices if that was done as well. Okay, we have 5 minutes. Let's just look at some ideas about what was Shiloh. Okay, this is what we have today. Like I said, people are very into Shiloh. If you look over here, it looks like they built a temple to look like the tabernacle of Shiloh. The tabernacle of Shiloh was not like the tabernacle of Moshe. The tabernacle of Moshe was literally beams and skins. Shiloh had a structure, had stone, but on top of the stone was the coverings. It wasn't a proper structure. Yeah, over here. So what was exactly in Shiloh is not so clear. Where is Shiloh? Shiloh is, if you look, I think, where do we have it over here? Here today also they have pictures. It goes into the Chabad.org. You could read some more about Shiloh, but here you have a better picture. I think this is a synagogue. Modern Shiloh built a synagogue to resemble the ancient Mishkan. So they built a synagogue in today what's modern Shiloh, which is kind of it's in the land of Ephraim. So it's north of Jerusalem, northeast. They built something to resemble the actual Mishkan, how it looked in the times of the Shiloh. Look over here, just a little. It says over here quickly, how long did Shiloh stand? Shiloh stood for what many do not realize is that prior to the temple of Jerusalem, a temple stood. He calls it a temple, but it was called the Mishkan in Shiloh, in the ancient town of Samaria, for a full 369 years. So for 369 years, they had the Mishkan. Again, it was built in a structure. It had stones, but it had the coverings of the Mishkan. So it wasn't built like the temple. It's a very long time, far longer than the United States has been independent. I'm not sure why that's important. Okay, and other interesting information. One could read more about Shiloh. It's going to come up again in the next class, which is the question of what we're learning about. What's the difference between Shiloh and the temple? I just want to see over here, if you have 2 minutes already. It says over here, I just want to, maybe this Tosfos is important. Okay. Now, basically, according to Reb Shimon, Tosfos says, according to Reb Shimon, the Nazareth did not bring his sacrifices on the small altar or the large altar. Again, that was also something that was not brought, even as though it was a donation, even though it's not a donation, it's a vow, because a person vows to become a Nazareth, but that was not brought in the even on the small altar or the large altar. And so therefore it's not mentioned because we're trying to talk about the differences between the small altar and the large altar. Okay, next week we're going to learn about Shiloh and Yerushalayim, but mainly we're going to go into the story of Chanya. Chanya is a very strange story. It's not clear. Again, I said Josephus tells the story a little differently, but the Rambam on the Mishnayos tells us the whole story. I printed it up. We could see the text. Basically, in a nutshell, during the times of Shimon the Righteous, which was the high priest in the beginning of the Second Temple, he's the one who confronts Alexander the Great. So Alexander, he passes away. He has two sons, and the sons get into disagreement that we're going to learn about. And one of the sons, Chanya, goes down to Egypt and builds a replica of the temple. And that temple, which stood for over 200 years, was like the Beis Hamikdash. And there's a lot of debate about the status of that temple because it's not in its place, right? So once Jerusalem becomes the center, you can't have a temple standing up in Alexandria. This was in Alexandria of Egypt. It was destroyed only after the second temple was destroyed. But there's a lot of debate if it was a house of idol worship, if it was a house of serving for God, if it was only for the Gentiles, not for the Jews. But when the Rebbe spoke in 1992, I think
the Gemara, there's a Gemara.
Yeah.
I think there's a Gemara, and I think it was in Menachot that talks about it. It has like a whole couple dafs about it. It talks about like comparing the base Chanya
to the Beis Hamikdash. Yeah, very good. Yes. So that's going to come up in next week's class. We're going to talk about it. But the conventional wisdom is if it's positive or not positive, A lot of people look at it as a negative because the halacha is if you served in the house of Chani, you can't serve in the temple. Vessels in Chani can't be used in the temple. But when the Rebbe talked in 1992, the Rebbe actually said that when Mashiach comes, there's going to be a rebuilding of everything. The Rebbe mentions even the rebuilding of the house of Chania. So, I mean, the story comes from a negative start. He was trying to murder his brother. That's obviously not a good thing, according to most opinions. Someone's trying to murder someone, but he built a temple. Seemingly, it ended up being a house of positivity. I think, according to most, I think the accepted version was is that it was a house of worship for the nations. All right, everyone. Wonderful. Till next week. Laila Tov. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Rabbi.